Daf Yomi, Tractate Menachot, page 67. Samach Zayin Amid Aleph, top of the page, with the words Gilgul Hekdesh Poter, D'Tznan, Hekdesha Isasa Ad Shelo Gilgala Upadata Chayevis, Mishe Gilgala Upadata Chayevis, Hekdesha Ad Shelo Gilgala Begilgala Hagizbao. Achar kach padata petura shibishas chovasa haisa petura. Rava adds the kneading of consecrated dough exempts it from the obligation of challah. As we learned in the Mishnah in Challah 3:3, if a woman consecrated her dough before she kneaded it and she subsequently redeemed it, she is obligated to separate challah. Likewise, if she consecrated it after she kneaded it, and then she redeemed it, she is obligated to separate challah. But if she consecrated the dough before she kneaded it, and the temple treasurer kneaded it, and then she subsequently redeemed it, she is exempt. The reason is that at the time that its obligation in challah would have taken effect, meaning at the time of its kneading, it was exempt because it was temple property. Boirava gilgul goimai misnat nan ger shinizgaer yehoiseloi iso nases ad sheloi nizgaer patur mishinizgaer chayav sofik chayav. Rava raises a dilemma. If dough was kneaded while in the possession of a Gentile, what is its status? Is one who acquires it after it has been kneaded obligated to separate challah from it or not? The Gemara answers that this is taught explicitly, as we learned in a Mishnah in Challah 3:6, with regard to a convert who converted and had dough in his possession. If it was prepared before he converted, he is exempt from the obligation of challah. If it was prepared after he converted, he is obligated. If he is uncertain, he is obligated. Haman kitani la divrei hakol hi ve'afilu Rabbi Meir ve'Rabbi Yehuda dekol mechai v'hoson patri hacha. The Gemara asks of the sages who disagreed with regard to the obligation to tithe grain that is smoothed by a Gentile. Who taught this Mishnah with regard to challah? Perhaps it was a ruling upon which everyone agrees, and even Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, who obligate there in the case of tithes, exempt here in the case of challah. Hasamud ichtiv digancha yatira. The Gemara explains the possibility. There are 3 verses written with regard to Truma that contain the term your grain. They are, you may not eat within your gates the tithe of your grain, Deuteronomy 12:17. And you shall eat before the Lord your God the tithe of your grain, Deuteronomy 12:17. And the first fruits of your grain you shall give him, Deuteronomy 18:4. It can therefore be claimed that only there Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda hold that one is obligated to separate tithes from grain that was owned by a Gentile, as in addition to the first reference to your grain, which excludes grain that was smoothed while in the temple's possession, it is written in an additional your grain, and then another reference to your grain. The Gemara elaborates, this is an example of a restrictive expression following a restrictive expression, and there is a hermeneutical principle that a restrictive expression following a restrictive expression comes only to include additional cases. In this case, the verses teach that even grain that belonged to Gentiles is obligated in the separation of tithes. But here, with regard to the obligation to separate challah, the term your dough is written only twice. Of the first of your dough you shall set apart a cake for a gift, as that which is set apart of the threshing floor, so shall you set it apart. Of the first of your dough you shall give to the Lord a portion for a gift throughout your generations. Numbers 15, 20 through 21. One reference is to your dough teaches that one is obligated to separate challah only from an amount equal to your dough in the wilderness where the mitzvah was commanded, meaning the volume of one omer. And one reference to your dough teaches that only the dough of an ordinary Jew is obligated, but not the dough of Gentiles, nor the dough of consecrated property. Oy dilma Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Shimon Ketanila Tikapatri Aval Rabbi Meir Rabbi Yehuda Gamri Reishis Mihosam. The Gemara continues, or perhaps it is Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon who taught that Mishnah as they maintain that grain that was smoothed by a Gentile owner is exempt from the obligation to separate tithes, and likewise dough needed by a Gentile owner is likewise exempt from the obligation to separate challah. But Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda derive, by way of verbal analogy, the halacha with regard to challah, concerning which it is written, of the first of your dough, from the same expression that appears there with regard to tithes, the first fruits of your grain. Just as in the case of tithes, they hold that one is obligated to separate the tithes from a pile of grain that was smoothed by a Gentile owner, so too they hold that one is obligated to separate challah from dough that was kneaded by a Gentile owner. Amorave Yehi Rava Lechazeh B'cheil Ma Adar Amorava Man Diomar Miruach Hagoy Poiter Gilgul Hagoy Poiter Man Damar Miruach Hagoy Ene Poiter Gilgul Hagoy Ene Poiter. Rava said, may it be God's will that I see the answer to my question in a dream. Wow. Yehi Rava Lechazeh B'cheil Ma. Should write that down. I haven't seen that in a long time. May it be God's will that I see the answer to my question in a dream. Rava then said, the one who says that the smoothing of a grain pile by its Gentile owner exempts a future Jewish owner from the obligation to separate tithes, also maintains that the kneading of dough by its Gentile owner exempts a future Jewish owner from any obligation to separate challah. So too, the one who says that the smoothing of grain pile by a Gentile owner does not exempt a future Jewish owner from the obligation to separate tithes, also maintains that the kneading of dough by a Gentile owner does not exempt a future owner from the obligation to separate challah. Goy shivrish petach hamor v'chala modi'im oso shupato v'chalaso necheles zoim upetach hamor goy yomed bo. Rabbi raised an objection to Rava from a Braita to Sefta Truma 4:13 with regard to a Gentile who separated a lamb in order to redeem a firstborn donkey, or if he separated challah from dough that he needed, one informs him that he is exempt from these obligations, and his challah may be eaten by non-priests, and the lamb designated to redeem his firstborn donkey may be shared and worked. Ha-truma so yesua. No, ha-truma so yesua. V'ho-haitana de'amar miruach ha-goy no-poiter v'gilgul goy poiter. One can infer, but if a Gentile separated truma with a portion of the produce designated for the priest from a grain pile that he smooths, his truma is prohibited to a non-priest. And this is an example of a Tana who says the smoothing of a grain pile by a Gentile owner does not exempt it from tithes, as the same halacha would apply to tithes as to truma, and yet he maintains that the kneading of dough by a Gentile owner exempts it from the obligation to separate challah. This refutes Rava's conclusion that one who holds that there is an exemption in the case of tithes likewise holds that an exemption applies to challah. וסכומוס מחוץ לארץ, פונדינו יסוי, שופטו, חרסוי לחרס זורים, ותרומסוי אינו מדמאס. התרומסוי בארץ אסורה מדמאס. And Ravina further raised an objection to our from Brisa with regard to Chalav a Gentile, that he separated after kneading his dough in Eretz Yisrael, or his Truma that he separated after smoothing his pile of grain outside Eretz Yisrael. In both cases, one informs him that he is exempt from those obligations, and his Chalav may be eaten by non-priests, and his Truma does not render a mixture prohibited. If it becomes mixed with non-sacred produce, one can infer, but his Truma from his grain in Eretz Yisrael is prohibited to non-priests and renders a mixture prohibited if it becomes mixed with non-sacred produce. The Gemara explains the objection, and again, this is an example of a Tana who says the smoothing of a grain pile by a Gentile owner does not exempt it from tithes, and nevertheless he maintains that the kneading of dough by a Gentile owner exempts it from the obligation to separate challah. The Gemara answers, this ruling that the smoothing of a grain pile by its Gentile owner does not exempt it from its obligations of truma and tithes applies only by rabbinic law. By Torah law, the smoothing of a grain pile by its Gentile owners does exempt it from the obligation to separate truma and tithes. The sages enacted a decree due to the schemes of people of means. There was a fear that conniving merchants might temporarily transfer ownership of their produce to Gentiles while the piles were smoothed, and after which the Gentiles would return them to their possession, thereby circumventing the obligation to separate truma and tithes. Very clever. Okay. Let's see. Let's continue up until the mission of the next page, because it's one idea. We're on a roll here. 67b. Ihachi, if so, Chalanami Efshade Apela Pachos Mechveshes Chavoim Kemachvoid. The Gemara asked, if so, then Chala should be subject to the same rabbinic decree as well, to prevent someone from circumventing their obligation to separate Chala by temporarily selling their dough to a Gentile who will need it and return it to them. Why then does the right to teach that dough is needed by a Gentile owner is exempt? The Gemara answers, there's no need for a decree in this case, since if one wanted to circumvent his obligation to separate challah from his dough, there's an easier method is available. It's possible for him to bake using less than 5/4 of a kav of flour and a bit more, the minimum amount necessitating the separation of challah. Trumanami efshar d'abedei kitab Yehoshua, dam Rabbi Yehoshua, ma'arim adam al tivoaso machniso b'motz shila kedei shetei b'mhemto. אוכלס פתוח מן המעשר מן המדייל ודרך גגוס ודרך כרפי ויוס. The Gemara answers, if so, why is there a need for a rabbinic decree with regard to truma and tithes? The obligation to separate truma and tithes can also be easily circumvented by acting in accordance with that which Rabbi Yehoshua suggested. As Rabbi Yehoshua suggested, a person can employ artifice to circumvent obligations incumbent upon him in dealing with his grain, and exempt himself by bringing it into his courtyard in its chaff, so that his animal may eat from it, and this grain is exempt from truma and tithe. Although the obligation to separate truma from and to tithe produce that has been fully processed applies even to animal fodder, it is permitted to feed one's animal untithed produce that has not been fully processed. Alternatively, another option of avoiding the obligation of truma and tithe is to bring in the produce to his house by way of roofs or by way of enclosures, karpefot. The obligation of truma and tithe applies only to produce that passes through the entrance of the house. Asam v'forchesio zila beimil zo hachbetzino lo zila beimil. So the Gemara answers, there in the case of truma and tithes, the two options of bringing in the grain in its chaff or by way of roofs are performed in public, the farhesia. And it is degrading for one to be seen circumventing his obligation. Consequently, one who wishes to avoid the obligation would prefer the option of transferring ownership to a Gentile, which the sages prevent with their decree. Here, in the case of challah, the option of baking with less than the minimum quantity of flour to avoid being obligated to separate challah from the dough is performed in private, and it is not degrading for him, and he would sooner take advantage of that option than go through the process of transferring the dough to a Gentile. Therefore, the sages did not apply their decree in this case. And that concludes that portion. Again, we went in a considerable amount into this daf, more than usual, but it was worth it because it was part of the idea. So 67b, pick it up on next daf with the Mishnah. Bezras Hashem.